War has always been a place where the line between life and death is painfully thin, where survival often depends on seconds, inches, or pure chance. And yet every once in a while, a story emerges that feels almost impossible to believe. A story about a man who seemed to survive everything thrown at him. A man many began to call the soldier who refused to die. His journey did not begin with anything extraordinary, because like millions of others, he was just an ordinary young man before the war, living a quiet life, unaware that history was about to pull him into one of the most violent chapters the world had ever seen. A time when entire nations would clash, and millions would be sent to the front lines with little understanding of what awaited them. When the war finally arrived, he answered the call without hesitation, driven by duty, by belief, and perhaps by the same sense of purpose that pushed so many others into uniform, never imagining that his story would become something so unusual. From the very beginning, he was placed in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, where survival was never guaranteed and every moment carried risk. The battlefield was a relentless storm of noise and destruction, filled with gunfire, explosions, and confusion, where soldiers were forced to move forward even when fear threatened to take over. During his first major engagement, his unit came under heavy attack, forcing them into a desperate fight to hold their ground as enemy fire rained down without pause. In the middle of that chaos, he was hit and thrown to the ground, the impact leaving him barely aware of what was happening around him. And for a moment, it seemed like his story would end there, just another life lost in a war that had already taken so many. But against all expectations, he survived, rescued and treated before eventually returning to the front, carrying his wounds, but refusing to step away from the fight. What followed began to change the way people saw him, because it did not happen just once. Time after time, he found himself in situations where survival seemed impossible, moments where entire groups were lost while he somehow remained alive. There were instances where explosions tore through positions, leaving destruction in every direction, yet he emerged from the aftermath, shaken but still standing. There were times when enemy fire closed in from all sides, trapping soldiers with no clear escape, and still, he managed to make it through. With each passing incident, the stories grew, spreading among the soldiers who served beside him, turning him into something more than just a fellow fighter. Some called it luck, others believed it was fate, and a few began to whisper that there was something about him that could not be explained, something that made him different. As the war continued, his reputation followed him wherever he went, and the stories became more detailed, more unbelievable, yet always grounded in the reality of what others had seen with their own eyes. There was the time he was caught in a sudden ambush, surrounded and outnumbered, yet somehow fought his way out when it seemed there was no chance left. There was another moment when a powerful explosion struck near his position, leaving devastation all around him, but he survived with injuries that, while serious, were not enough to end his life. Each event added another layer to the legend, building an image of a man who could not be stopped, a man who kept surviving when others could not. But inside, he did not feel like a legend. He did not see himself as someone special or protected. In fact, the more he survived, the more he understood just how fragile everything really was. He saw the randomness of war up close, watching as men just as strong, just as brave and just as determined fell beside him. He knew that there was no clear reason why he was still alive while others were not, and that knowledge stayed with him, turning what others saw as a gift into something much heavier. Survival was not just about being alive. It was about carrying the memory of everything that had been lost. There were moments when even he began to question how long it could continue, how many times a person could escape death before it finally caught up with them. These thoughts stayed in the back of his mind, following him into every new mission, every new battle, every moment where danger once again became unavoidable. But war does not stop for doubt, and it does not allow time for answers. It moves forward, and so did he, focusing not on what might happen, but on what needed to be done in the present. One of the most intense moments of his journey came during a battle that pushed him to his absolute limits, a situation where his unit was tasked with holding a critical position against overwhelming enemy forces. From the very beginning, the odds were against them, with the enemy advancing in numbers that made the outcome seem almost certain. As the fighting intensified, the situation quickly turned desperate, with explosions tearing through their defenses and gunfire coming from every direction. One by one, the soldiers around him were forced out of the fight, either falling where they stood or being forced to retreat under pressure, until only a few remained to hold the line. Despite the chaos and the growing danger, He refused to back down. Moving through the battlefield, he continued to fight, pushing himself forward even as the situation became more dangerous with every passing moment. At one point, a powerful blast struck close enough to throw him off his feet, leaving him disoriented and surrounded by destruction. The kind of moment that should have ended everything. For a brief second, there was nothing but silence, the kind that follows something overwhelming. And then slowly, he began to move again. Against all expectations, he stood up once more, proving once again that he was still alive. By the time reinforcements arrived, the battlefield had been transformed into a scene of devastation, with only a small number of survivors left standing. Among them was the man whose story had already begun to spread, the man who had once again survived what seemed impossible. That moment solidified his reputation, turning him into a symbol of endurance in the eyes of those who had witnessed it. A living reminder that sometimes survival goes beyond what logic can explain. When the war finally came to an end, he returned home like so many others, but unlike most, he carried a story that had already taken on a life of its own. People who heard about him saw something extraordinary, someone who had faced death again and again and somehow come out on the other side each time. But for him, the story was different. It was not about escaping death, but about living through it, about experiencing the reality of war in a way that could never truly be explained to those who had not been there. In the years that followed, his story continued to spread, sometimes growing larger with each retelling, sometimes becoming something closer to myth than reality, but always centered around the same idea: the soldier who refused to die. And yet, the truth remained simple and deeply human. He was not invincible. He was not chosen. He was a man who endured. A man who kept moving forward even when everything around him suggested that he should not be able to. And perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. Not the idea that he could not die, but the fact that he kept living, that he continued despite everything that stood in his way. In the end, his story is not just about war or survival, but about the strength that exists within ordinary people. The kind of strength that does not come from being fearless or unbreakable, but from the decision to keep going, no matter how impossible it may seem.